Hi, I'd like to welcome you to session 3 of Believe It or Not, an exploration of world religious traditions. You'll notice that the venue this week looks slightly different than our previous weeks. We had an issue during the class with the video recording, so I am doing this at a different place at a different time, but I'm going to present the same material that I presented at class this week. So today we're going to be talking about Indigenous religious traditions. And when we talk about Indigenous traditions, we probably have a sense of what that means. Let's first look at the word Indigenous and what that implies. We can talk not only about Indigenous religious traditions, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures, we can talk about Indigenous plant and animal species. For example, we could say the indigenous pines of Minnesota are the red pine, the white pine, and the jack pine. Scots pine is not an indigenous pine to Minnesota. We can also talk about indigenous creatures, fishes, insects, and oftentimes in opposition to indigenous species, we talk about invasive species. And in class, we were discussing various types of invasive species, such as purple loosestrife, zebra mussels, English sparrows, dandelions. They do carry the implication of a negative, an invasive species, which can push out or damage the habitat of the native or indigenous species, not allowing them to compete effectively in their former habitat. And certainly this has been the case with indigenous peoples in many times and many places. The word indigenous comes from the Latin, meaning basically born in or native to, occurring naturally in a particular place. There is with cultures this sense of first people. When we look at our friends to the north in Canada, they refer to the native peoples as the First Nation. So those individuals who were in a particular geographic location first. These groups tend to have distinctive not only cultural characteristics, religion, but linguistic characteristics as well, social characteristics, things like that. About 4% of the world's population today are considered to be indigenous peoples, peoples who, religiously speaking, have a way of life that is distinct from other religious traditions. And we're going to take a look at what are the similarities amongst these very diverse peoples, truly, in terms of location, language, all kinds of characteristics. But there are enough commonalities amongst these groups to justify us defining them as a particular religious type of group. And there are similarities, there are differences, so we are going to explore them. So these peoples come from across the world, and you can think, I'm sure, of many indigenous peoples, such as the Native Americans in the US. And next week, we're going to have the good fortune to hear from a Native American teacher by the name of Eagleman Ed McGaw. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic, various groups in Africa, and those who came to the Americas and followed traditions such as voodoo or Santeria. We have the Aborigines in Australia, the Sami people in Lapland. Actually, my family, in part, our family tradition is that they come from Sami peoples way far northern Scandinavia. Also, there's indigenous peoples in India and Russia, so scattered throughout the world. So what are some of the notable differences among these indigenous traditional people? One of the big ones is that today, some of these groups still live in remote enclaves. Picture the peoples in the Amazon, for example, or far in the north of Canada or Alaska, whereas others are trying to follow their traditional ways while living in the middle of a city middle of Minneapolis, for example. We still would consider these as indigenously religious people, but they're certainly not living in the same sort of circumstances that they were when these practices evolved over time. Another important difference is how far have these traditional beliefs evolved as they came into contact with other religious traditions. And certainly there are very few pure indigenous traditions today. The particularly Christian missionaries, as we all know, were and have been quite aggressive in contacting these sorts of groups and sharing their own particular religious beliefs, sometimes in what we might say a very arrogant or hierarchical way, like my beliefs are better than your beliefs, so you better believe what I believe. Not to critique the missionaries, but there has been certainly a mix of good and bad, and a lot of it maybe not so good for the traditional cultures. So some groups have taken on the new beliefs. You can look at Mexico, for example, where many people are Roman Catholic. They would identify themselves as Roman Catholic, although evangelical traditions are also making big inroads, Pentecostals and such, in Mexico. But there is an admixture of the traditional beliefs in the way that Roman Catholicism is practiced in Mexico. And this would be true in a lot of places. And we're going to see this not only in, for example, Christianity, but Buddhism is the same case where local indigenous traditional practices have been integrated in with Buddhist practice. We'll see that in Tibetan Buddhism for sure. So, but there certainly are enough similarities, as I said before, to allow us to identify this as a single category. So what are some of these characteristics? These are the traditions of what we would identify as the original people in a given geographical area, number one. Number two, the teachings have been passed on orally, and in many cases continue to be passed on orally. Now, there's a good thing about this that I want to explore a bit, and you can think further about this. Oral traditions are by nature organic, although they certainly can be passed on in really highly coherent fashion over time. There also is the possibility that these traditions will evolve over time with changing circumstances. Whereas when these traditions are written down, as we see in, for example, the Bible, the Quran, New Testament, Hebrew Bible, others, they tend to get fixed. And many people will look at these as something immutable back to the point where these books were edited or written down. It can be tempting to see them as something eternal and unchanging, which oral tradition never is. Oral tradition is organic. Third common point. The traditions were often kept secret from those who conquered or came to their lands to present their own ideas. So maybe a little bit of the truth of these traditions was given out, but there was often some part of it that was kept back, that was kept secret, that was protected. Even if the people profess to convert to this new tradition, they may hold on to these true beliefs and continue to practice them in secret. And we saw that with the Native Americans. They didn't have a lot of choice in many cases whether or not to convert. That was also the case with the Jewish people in, for example, Spain, where they were forced to convert but would continue in some cases to practice their Jewish beliefs in secret. I was fortunate enough earlier in my life to have a friend. Her name was Mrs. Medicine. I know she wouldn't mind me telling you this story. She was born in Canada, and was taken from her family at, I think, age 8 or 9 and put in a school, an Indian school, and was not allowed to speak her language, was not allowed to wear her clothes, not allowed to see her family. And she found that to be really a devastating experience. She remembers when she was maybe 12 that she developed a severe throat infection, was very ill. Word got back to her mother, her parents, of this situation. Her mother came to the school to try to see her, and they wouldn't let her see my friend. It's hard to see how that's a good thing. All right, number 5. Did I say number 4? The conquerors attempted to wipe out the native beliefs, and that was my example with my friend Mrs. Medicine. Number 5, old beliefs become blended with the new, and we talked about that in terms of how these traditions can differ, the degree to which they became blended, and there's a term for that, syncretism, for those of you who enjoy religious jargon or lingo. Syncretism is the coming together of two belief systems. 6, Indigenous beliefs involve an interest in and a connection with all of life. They're nature-based, not that these individuals worship nature per se, but they experience their spirituality through the world of nature. And spirituality is involved in every moment, everything, every experience. We talked about this in the introductory session 1, that there's no division between the spiritual and the secular, the sacred and the sexual. The spiritual is involved in every activity of life, every type of organism. There's a spiritual presence in all that is, in the entire created order. The world is viewed as being full of symbol and story. You'll see this in the Native American traditions, where the sighting of a particular animal has great significance, or a particular rock, the appearance of a particular rock that will come to you at a certain time. I was out for a walk with a friend yesterday, and we were having a real heart-to-heart talk about life transitions and changes. We were down by the Mississippi River, and an bald eagle flew very nearby us, and it felt like a sign, felt like a good omen. Number 8, the people and their beliefs are tied strongly to the land. There's no real separation between the people, the creatures, and the land. It's all one piece. Number 9, there's no attempt to convert others to their way of seeing the world, their particular religious beliefs and traditions. In fact, it's the opposite. There's often an attempt to keep people out. Number 10, there is an interesting similarity amongst the mythic traditions of the indigenous peoples of the world. We talked about this in the first session too, that virtually every tradition has a flood story. I did a seminar once upon a time at a college in Chicago about the various flood story myths, how they have, in a sense, a common basis, but they're explicated in fascinatingly different ways. Like, different truths are derived from the fact that the world flooded at some point in time. Number 11, a common symbol amongst indigenous peoples is a symbol of the circle. We can certainly understand the significance of the circle, as we talked about, the unity of all. Also may represent an understanding of a circular rather than a linear view of time, the recurrence of the seasons, and such and so forth. Circle speaks of togetherness, of the sun, moon, the planets. We will see next week, I'm sure that Ed will talk about the sacred hoop and the 4 directions in the Lakota traditions. Number 12 is the importance of maintaining right relationships with all that is. Our human kinfolk, our animal kinfolk, the plants, the earth. We should be in good relationship with all that is, for all is seen as having a spiritual component. The sacredness of the land, our role as caretakers, not exploiters, of the earth. It is our responsibility to care for what we have and certainly never abuse or overuse. The world of nature, and this is a real different perspective than what our European Western cultures have. The world of nature is seen as dominant. We tend to look at human beings as dominant. Many of the native or indigenous traditions see nature as dominant, and we have a role within that larger whole, which is not greater or lesser than any of the other creatures. I have a little bit of a reading I want to share with you, and this is from the book Living Religions. It's an anthology of living religions. It's very nice. It's an accompaniment to another textbook. And this is readings from the various traditions. This is called That Mountain Has Spirit and is credited to the Southwest Indigenous peoples. And it came from a collection by Stephen Trimble. Stephen Trimble's the editor, Our Voices, Our Land. You go out and you get a certain piece of rock. It's not just a rock. It's got energy forces in it. It's a living thing too. You look at that mountain, and that mountain has spirit. That mountain has holiness. There's a quiet there, and yet there's a fervor there. And if you've ever seen clouds there, you see that mountain like a hand grasping those clouds. There's life up there. That's why it's sacred. Before you go hunting, the important thing is that you are going to have a little prayer to the Mother Nature, the nature of the sky, and then the animal, and then you more or less cry a little bit and ask Mother Nature to spare you some meat. When you go into that forest, you have to be the deer. We must try and worship the land, the ground, the stars, and the skies, for they are the ones that have spirit. They are the mighty spirits which guide and direct us, which help us to survive. 13, many of the traditions have a concept, or most, if not all, have a concept of a great spirit, a supreme being, some overall spiritual force, some ultimate reality. Goes by many names, many different descriptions, many different mythical pictures of what this ultimate reality is like. Sometimes they're males, sometimes they're females, sometimes androgynous, sometimes without form whatsoever. But an awareness of our relationship to this ultimate reality is very important. Yet the emphasis is placed on daily life and our spiritual relationships with that which occurs in our daily life. Number 14, ancestors tend to be very important. Understanding that the ancestors are another type of relationship that we have to maintain in a healthy fashion, and guidance might be seen as coming from the ancestors. I hope that all of you have read the wonderful book Black Elk Speaks. If you have not, I would certainly go and get a copy and read it and appreciate it and think about it. 15, back to the myths. Most, if not all, have a creation myth of some story. I like the story that's given in the Nigerian Yoruba creation account, in which there's only one a godhead, a dimensionless point, an infinite container of everything, including itself. This very intense point was smashed by a rebellious slave and broke into hundreds of fragments, each of which became an orisa, a deity or object of worship. The ultimate purpose of life is to return all to this original wholeness. Now, this to me sounds an awful lot like the Big Bang, and is also highly reminiscent of the creation story coming out of the Kabbalistic Jewish mystical tradition. Last point, dreams are considered especially significant and teach us how to act in life. Also, attention is paid to visions and animal guides. There's a sense that the dream world relates to our everyday reality, and we can learn from that dream world, that we, in a sense, receive an education of sorts while We're speaking, and dreams should be interpreted. They can be understood. There are elders and spiritual guides, shamans who can help interpret dreams. Important dreams and visions especially may occur when one is fasting, going without food or water, actually seeking a vision. The indigenous traditions are not structural. They don't have generally buildings or hierarchical structures or seminaries, but there certainly are religious teachers and leaders of various sorts. Guides, healers, shamans, storytellers, drummers, and shamans, not dramans. And these people, like I say, don't go to seminary. They're mentored, they're taught by others in their discipline. And there's something to be said for the fact that these people in these roles are not made, but they are born into this role. They learn their art, but there's a gift that they have that's innate that enables them to be spiritual guides and spiritual teachers. There are always, as there are in all traditions, ceremonies, recognitions of the various life transitions, such as birth, puberty, marriage, death, and also quite often pilgrimages to sacred sites. Now, the questions that I would like you to ponder as you think about Indigenous traditions moving forward to our next week's discussion. What are the challenges facing Indigenous peoples today? Certainly we can think about loss of language, loss of land, loss of culture, cultural devastation in many cases. And really how can us non-Indigenous folks help support the effort of refinding wholeness and the place in the world of these peoples who have so much to offer us. And the other point being, what can we learn from these Indigenous belief systems that we can bring into our own life? Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to getting back together next week. Thanks.